to feel most comfortable with that. If you need to either keep your camera off or change your name in order to remain confidential, that is totally appropriate because it will be subject to public disclosure. Great, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, we're here with Best Starts for Kids childcare programming. My name is Jessica. We're delighted to have you here. And today we're specifically going to be talking a little bit about the subsidy work that is coming up in the RFP that will be released in the next couple of months for subsidy. There is additional childcare programming that we'll touch on briefly. Just to be really clear, we'll have another open house that goes over other opportunities as well. So know that we may not answer all of your questions today, but that this is a good starting place for us to begin the conversation. Thanks, Katie. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so when we have conversations about Best Starts, I think most of the folks on this call are familiar with the work that this initiative has done over the past 6 years. But I always like to ground this conversation in our goals for the whole initiative, not just the childcare work. And those really come back to happy, healthy, safe, and thriving. And so for us, when we think about investing in childcare, we are always coming back to that, those ideals. We're coming back to happy and healthy and safe kiddos. We're talking about thriving families. And we're also talking about happy, healthy, safe, and thriving childcare providers who are just such a critical part of our community. Those are really the things that will drive this work moving forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. I did want to share just a little bit of some of the community engagement work that's been done over the past few years to really sort of understand the field of childcare, which I think we had sort of an anecdotal understanding of. But there's been some really deep work to understand what are the needs of families, what are the needs of providers, and what do people want? What are people asking for to better support the field? You'll see here that there was a report that came out in 2018 from King County's Women Advisory Board, and that was really about access and affordability of childcare in King County. The state did a similar study that went really deep in looking at how expensive childcare is in Washington state. I'm going to excuse myself for just one moment due to a lack of childcare, and I will be right back. Okay, the last report that I want to just highlight is from our Children and Family Strategy Task Force. This was a group that was convened shortly before the beginning of the pandemic. And this group was really tasked with studying access and affordability of childcare in King County. One of the things that was pretty amazing about that group is that they also took a holistic view. So they really recognized that you can't sort of move one lever in childcare without looking at the others. So they looked at what could we invest in? How could we better support childcare to create a truly holistic and equitable system for families, for kids, and for the providers who do this really incredible work. Next slide, please. So out of that report came 20 recommendations for the county to consider. And some of those were sort of long-term values-oriented goals. And some of those were really specific things that we can invest in. Those recommendations are really what are driving the Best Starts for Kids investment in childcare. So some of the things that really stood out to that group was sort of a creation of anti-racist principles, guidance for county revenue that's in alignment with values, and thinking about how we remain accountable to families and to childcare providers. In terms of a sort of programmatic perspective, the big things that stood out, excuse me one second, were an emphasis on equitable wages and benefits, as well as financial supports for King County families. And that's really what informed the creation of subsidy work through Best Starts. Go to the next slide, please. There are some current King County investments that have been really exciting and good opportunities for us to learn more about how we as the county can support the field. Those include a student veterans pilot that is focused on subsidies specifically for veterans pursuing higher education. Our early learning facilities work is just getting launched. It's called PASTA, which stands for Puget Sound Taxpayer Accountability Account. And that is really focused on how can we expand facilities, improve facilities, and develop new facilities for childcare so that we can ensure expansion of slots. And then we've also run 3 rounds of COVID emergency childcare investments in partnership with childcare resources. And one of those rounds was also in partnership with the city of Seattle, making sure that we held slots for essential workers and providing additional subsidy for families who were impacted by COVID. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move into what you're really here to learn about, which is Best Starts for Kids renewal, what we're talking about with childcare, which is the new, very large and really exciting investment of 2.0. Next slide, please. So there are 2 main investments that we're looking at for childcare over the next 6 years. One is the Childcare Worker Wage Enhancement Project. We're sometimes calling that a workforce demonstration project. That project we're not going to talk about a ton today, but I'm happy to answer high-level questions. We'll have another open house in a couple of months to talk more about that one. The workforce demonstration project is really around adding a salary supplement for a group of childcare providers and looking at the impact on retention and continuity of care. The other investment that we're here to talk about today in greater depth, and Katie will really go into this more fully, is the Childcare Subsidy Program. And that'll be a program to serve families with kiddos aged birth through age 12. Next slide, please, Katie. So briefly, I will just share for this wage enhancement, what we're looking at is really thinking about what does it mean to increase wages for childcare providers. We know that across the state, childcare providers are in the 3rd percentile of earners. So while they're doing this critical work throughout a pandemic, for ages and ages, that keeps communities going, that provides integral supports for families, and there's really critical, strong first beginnings for kiddos, that they are earning less than about 97% of other occupations in the state. And we think that's a real problem, and it's not in alignment with equity at all. So this will look at the impact of a wage increase on how we can retain childcare providers and program quality, but really as defined by families and providers. So looking at continuity of care, relationships, all of those things. Our intention is to fund that wage enhancement for about 1,400 childcare providers over the 6-year levy. And that once providers are in the program, that they will continue to receive that wage enhancement throughout the life of the levy or until their employment ends, whichever one comes first. This specific investment will be focused on licensed providers. We'll have more information coming about that. And that RFP, you can expect to see that coming out in April of 2022. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll pass it over to Katie to dive into subsidy.
So I think that it comes as no surprise to anyone on this call that childcare is really unaffordable for a lot of families in King County. A 2019 Best Starts for Kids survey found that 34% of children in King County are living in families who find it difficult to afford childcare. And at the same time, these high prices of care, as Jessica mentioned, are not allowing for our essential childcare workers to be earning a living wage. And so there's a real problem with the finance of childcare in King County. This is a challenge that has been recognized by a lot of lawmakers and policymakers, and there have been some really important changes recently in response to this. The Fair Starts for Kids Act at the state level in 2021, I believe, the years are blending together. They made some important changes to the state childcare subsidy, Working Connections. They increased the income eligibility from about up to about $60,000 for a family of 4, which has been an incredible boost. We just heard recently that they've had about 2,000 new families join since October. So an incredible expansion of the state subsidy. However, in King County, $90,000 for a family of 4 is considered low income when it comes to affordable housing. And so you can see there's this large gap between what the state child care subsidy will, the families who are eligible for that, and what the cost of living is in King County, which leads to, in King County, a pretty major benefits cliff. So let's say a family of 4 is earning $65,000 a year. They go from having most of their childcare subsidized at $60,000 a year to none of their childcare subsidized at $65,000 a year. And if they have an infant and a preschooler in care, they're going to be spending over 50% of their income on a licensed childcare slot. And the US Department of Health and Human Services says that 7% of a family's income is the threshold for affordability for childcare. So we have a major challenge with folks who are just above income for the state childcare subsidy and who live with the high cost of living in King County. There are also many families in King County who fall below the income eligibility for the state childcare subsidy, but are ineligible for other reasons. They may not have an approved activity, for example, or their children may not meet the eligibility requirements for the state subsidy. For example, if their children are not documented. And so the vision of this Best Starts for Kids childcare subsidy program is really to support families who are just above income for those state childcare supports, and then fill in the gaps in eligibility that really lead to inequitable access in our county. We are hoping at its height that the program provides subsidies for 3,000 children and their families. And we're working really hard right now to partner with key stakeholders like the city of Seattle, the state of Washington, and a large group of community stakeholders to make sure that we understand regional needs and ensure that we're aligning with other existing programs and that we're providing for equitable access. So as we think about the childcare program, the childcare subsidy program that we want to create, I want to just stop and do a term check. When I say subsidy, you may have also heard it called a voucher for childcare, or a scholarship for childcare, or childcare financial assistance. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is paying a portion of an eligible child's tuition for childcare each month. And so when we think about the program that we want to create, our priorities are that it be seamless, low barrier, transparent, and that it provides equitable access to high quality and affordable childcare in King County. We really want to build upon existing programming. We are not replacing or recreating the existing programs. We are very intentionally expanding eligibility for existing programs and filling gaps. And in that way, creating a really comprehensive net of support for families in King County. We also really value the ongoing feedback and learnings from families, communities, and childcare providers. And so we are designing a program that will have many opportunities for quality improvement and the integration of family, provider, and community voice. We also really value the wisdom of families when it comes to where they want their children to go for childcare. And we recognize that many children in King County are not in licensed childcare or in congregate care settings, and that they have chosen a family friend or a neighbor to provide their childcare. And so we, as part of this investment, are looking into ways that we can provide financial assistance for family, friend, and neighbor caregivers. But the childcare subsidy program that we're discussing today would specifically be providing support for children at licensed family home childcares, licensed childcare centers, and school age only programs. In terms of the populations that we are prioritizing for eligibility, again, looking at families who are just above income for those existing programs, such as Working Connections, the state childcare subsidy, so that we can ease that benefits cliff, so that families don't have to make that awful decision of turning down a raise or an opportunity for professional advancement because they're not going to be able to afford their childcare if they earn $100 more a month. We also really want to prioritize families who are ineligible for or not well served by existing programs. So this includes families whose children are undocumented, families who have a caregiver with a disability who may be unable to work, and also families who have whose caregivers are in certain education programs that are not considered eligible activities for the state childcare subsidy. And finally, we will be prioritizing families that have historically experienced additional and currently experience additional barriers to childcare access. And so this includes children who have developmental delays or complex medical needs, children who have been expelled or asked to leave childcare programs, and then families who live in parts of the county that have been historically underinvested in, and so do not have enough childcare slots for the population. These are often referred to as childcare deserts. So these are just a few of the communities that we will be prioritizing in terms of eligibility. Now, as we think through the critical bodies of work, the critical roles that exist in creating a subsidy like the one we've described, we really see there being two critical bodies of work to make a subsidy program both efficient and transparent and seamless and a really easy user experience for families and providers. And also that we make sure that we have really equitable, thoughtful outreach and opportunities for families to have tailored support, both accessing the subsidy, but then finding the childcare that they need and that the subsidy will pay for. And so I'm going to just very briefly describe these bodies of work that will make up that which we are contracting for in the RFP. And I will say this is relatively high level descriptions of these, and there will be a more in-depth info session once the RFP has been released. And so we'll do our best at the end of this description to answer questions that folks have, but recognize that there is a lot more information coming about this in short order. And so when I talk about subsidy administration as one of the bodies of work that we will be contracting, I'm talking about the hosting of the system to collect the applications, to manage client data, to pay providers. So a lot of the back end business needs of a childcare subsidy that is fundamentally paying providers on a regular basis. And so there's the subsidy administration would also be responsible for developing funding policies and procedures. They would be managing vendor relationships with providers. So that would include collecting tax documentation and reporting revenue, working to make sure that providers are paid in a timely, regular, predictable manner. They would also provide training and technical assistance for the people who were supporting family access. And then they also would be in charge of managing the budget, audit and oversight activities, and then data and evaluation activities for the subsidy. Now, the family access and support body of work. This body of work would be in charge of outreach and system navigation for families. So making sure that families that we are finding families across the county, that we are ensuring that that there is equitable, thoughtful, creative outreach, and that when families are working to access the subsidy, that they have responsive system navigation. They have someone who can help them actually apply and use their subsidy. This team might also support families to prepare, to submit their applications, and then advocate on behalf of their subsidy application. This would also include case management for families who have additional barriers to access that might require more support to be able to not only apply for the subsidy, but find a child care provider that meets the family's needs to use that subsidy. They would also provide ongoing technical assistance for families to, if they needed to change anything about their subsidy, or if they needed to reauthorize their eligibility. And then this family access and support function would also ensure a continuous quality feedback loop to the administration. And so that there would be regular opportunities to amplify family voice, to reflect on what's going well for families and community and child care providers, and then integrate that back into the administration. So when we're looking at the scope of what we will be contracting for, I'm offered the average annual funding that will be available from 2022 to 2027, the 6-year life of the levy. The subsidy administration body of work, there will be an average of $24.2 million per year available for this body of work. This includes the subsidy pass-through. So the vast majority of this will be passing through to child care providers on behalf of eligible children. The family access and support body of work will have an average annual funding available of about $1.2 million. So in terms of timeline and next steps for this RFP and the the Best Starts Child Care Subsidy Program, we plan to release the request for proposal, which is basically a request for applications for agencies, organizations that want to fill these bodies of work. We will release that sometime in March. In April and May, we will be selecting the contractors to carry out these bodies of work. Between May and September of 2022, we'll be contracting with those selected contractors and building out subsidy operations. And the goal is that by the fall of 2022, the subsidy application and the funding would be available to the public. All right, I know that's a very high level overview, but we would love to open the floor for questions now.
And Katie, I'm wondering if it might make sense for us to stop sharing our screen so that we can all see one another if folks are on camera.
Yeah, I love that.
Awesome, thank you. Looks like Sandra has her hand up.
Oh, it worked. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Very nice presentation. Question to you. It sounds as if Working Child Connection will be our base subsidy vehicle for the state, and King County will build over there. How does the city of Seattle subsidy enroll in that? Are they under you or over you?
Yeah, Sandra, thank you so much. And good morning to you.
Right.
That is a really good question. And it's one that we're working closely with the city and the state to make sure that we're being thoughtful of for a few reasons. We don't want to make it so that families or childcare providers have to navigate 3 totally different systems of reporting, of eligibility, all of that. We don't want to make it more complicated. What we've kind of been talking about as sort of an initial way of looking at it is that the state would provide that sort of foundational level, that we would come in on top of that and also fill in gaps, right? So that we might serve some families that are income eligible for working connections, but for whom either they're not eligible for another reason or it's not a good fit for their family. And then that the city will probably come in on top of us, but similarly fill gaps in our programming, because while we have a big investment, we also know it will not meet the full need. That is just the reality of childcare need in our county and our region. And so we anticipate that we would not be able necessarily to meet the full need in the city of Seattle. So we're partnering really closely with them, and we don't have a final answer yet. But what I will say it is our intention to be really well aligned, to minimize disruption for families and for childcare providers, and to try to figure out how we actually start building what feels like a holistic system across our region. David, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. So nice. Thank you for having this. One of the questions that we came up with is the core part of the core focus. So this particular program is really to emphasize, capture, and serve the families who are being served by other programs. Either they're displaced, they don't have access, there isn't enough infrastructure to support the application, or like the Cliff, they just barely don't meet the cutoff. Does the team have like a list of like major programs that folks aren't getting access to so that we can cross-reference, or that piece of the process of identifying these in need families who aren't being served by the other programs to kind of prevent that double dipping, but also make sure the target population is being captured as appropriately as possible.
Katie, do you want to answer that one?
Absolutely. It's a little hard to capture all of the possible childcare financial assistance options that people have, because oftentimes childcare providers will have their own individual. There will be scholarships that are specific to for very specific populations, for example, students. But in general, the big players in the childcare subsidy realm in King County is the Working Connections childcare subsidy that's run by the state of Washington. And as I said, that covers families who are working up to about $60,000 a year for a family of 4. It's 60% of the state median income is their cutoff. And then the city of Seattle has several programs. The one that we were referring to before is the Child Care Assistance Program, CCAP for short. And I believe that they cover residents of the city of Seattle up to about 94% of state median income. So they kind of cover that above the state income, the state subsidy income cutoff. And then there are various programs that help pay specifically for preschool programs. So the Seattle preschool program, there's ECAP, which is ECEAP. It's I never remember the exact acronym for that, but it's the state funded pre-K program for low income children. and then Head Start are some of the other big players in funding early learning and child.
And I think what
Did I miss anything?
I was just going to say what I would add to that, which is not exactly what you asked for, David, but I think is probably relevant, is that there are families that aren't eligible for these sort of like income reasons or working reasons. There are also families that we know have not been well served for a number of different reasons. And what I do think we have that will be present in the RFP is a really strong sort of description of values and prioritized populations of families that's informed both by the childcare work group that we're currently meeting with and that task force that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. So folks who've really been able to illuminate, here are the families we've been serving that are struggling to access and afford care. Other questions for us? Sandra, go ahead, please.
Are you thinking in your model for your families that they would need to recertify annually?
So I think what I will say is today, we're probably not going to get into the specifics because we're still finalizing some of that in partnership with the work group that's informing a lot of this RFP. We'll probably have more sort of technical information available at the information session once the RFP is released. More broadly, what I would say is our hope is to reduce barriers for both families and providers. So things like having as few requirements for recertification or reauthorization, or as few requirements for activity requirements. Those are things that we're really exploring where we can kind of push the envelope and say, how do we serve families and make sure that they've got strong continuity of care? So that's a great question, and one that maybe we can mark down and hopefully address in the info session.
And I love your response, because that's what we're stumbling against, is the families are not meeting the recertification, forgetting about it, and it's really a big hassle for families. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. Charisse, great question. Charisse has a question about Build Back Better, which is the bill that is before Congress that would really, at least in its current form, provide pretty significant investment in childcare. Charisse, I will share that we have been monitoring this so closely, and towards the end of last year, we felt a thrill as we watched it sort of move through and thought for sure it was going to pass before the end of the year. As I'm sure many of you know, that bill has stalled and it feels less likely to pass in its entirety, although it's possible, right? And I think from our perspective, what we think of is we don't feel proprietary over supporting childcare. We want to see families and kids get the care they need. We want to see providers paid the wages that they deserve. And we want to be a part of that where we can be and need to be. But if Build Back Better passes, it provides a much stronger foundation. I think the two things that we know are that in the initial few years of implementation, there would absolutely be a pretty major need for many King County families. They sort of have a plan to ramp up programming, and we might actually see rates increase for some of those families who are just above income cutoff in order to meet some of the other requirements. So we see a really strong role for us in sort of easing families into that program. In general, what I will say is, regardless of whether Build Back Better passes, we intend to provide some additional financial assistance for families and some salary supplement work for providers. It will just look different depending on if Build Back Better passes. And it's something that we would work closely with the state and city on as well to make sure that we're not duplicating or, again, creating more challenges for providers or families. But the plan will be to celebrate if Build Back Better passes. Got some feedback from Courtney Whitaker around the commitment to supporting families that don't traditionally qualify for working connections, but meet the income thresholds. That has been a really big value expressed both by the current work group and the task force. So we're going to do our best to prioritize that throughout programming. Any other questions or thoughts today? Okay, I think I waited for the mandatory 10 awkward seconds of silence. And so I will go ahead and say thank you to all of you for spending your time with us today. We did record this, so it should be available, I think, on the Best Starts blog later on. And Katie and I can be your points of contact. Once the RFP is released, we won't be able to talk to you about it, but in the interim, if you have sort of high-level questions, we're both available. Katie's really the expert on subsidy, and I'm kind of the broader childcare person. So please feel free to reach out at any time. And thank you all for the work you do. We're really grateful for you and excited to be moving forward with this work. Have a wonderful day.